In the spring of 1940, a chilling silence hung over the border between Belgium and Germany. For months, the world had been locked in the phony war, a tense standoff where great armies stared at each other across barbed wire and tank traps. But while the public waited, military experts across Europe were engaged in a different kind of calculation. They were looking at a map of eastern Belgium, at a specific point where the Albert Canal met the Meuse River. There, carved into the very marrow of the earth, sat Fort Eben-Emael. By 1940, it wasn't just a military installation, it was a legend. It was widely considered the most advanced, most formidable defensive structure ever conceived by human hands. If the French Maginot Line was a wall, Eben-Emael was a locked gate, one that no key in the Arsenal seemed capable of turning. The statistics alone were enough to discourage any attacker. The scale, it covered an area of roughly 75 hectares, the size of 70 football fields, wedged into a massive plateau. The construction, it was carved directly into solid marl rock, reinforced with millions of tons of high-grade concrete and thick steel plating. The armament, from its subterranean depths rose massive armored cupolas and retractable turrets. It housed 120mm and 75mm cannons that could rain high-explosive shells on any target within a 16-kilometer radius. Belgian officers walked its gleaming, white-tiled corridors with a sense of total security. They didn't just call it strong, they called it impregnable. They believed as long as Eben-Emael stood, the heart of Belgium was safe. But across the border, in the darkened rooms of the German High Command, the fortress was viewed through a different lens. To Adolf Hitler and his generals, Eben-Emael wasn't an obstacle to be avoided, it was a problem that had to disappear. And it had to happen in minutes, not days. While the Belgians polished their guns and waited for a traditional siege, the Germans were preparing a strike so radical, so unprecedented, that it would change the face of warfare forever. To understand why Eben-Emael was so critical, you have to understand the geography of the looming conflict. In 1940, Germany's blitzkrieg strategy relied on one thing: speed. The German panzer divisions needed to scream across the Belgian plains to outflank the French armies and reach the English Channel. Standing directly in their path were three vital bridges over the Albert Canal: Veldwezelt, Vroonhoven, and Caen. If those bridges were blown up, the German advance would grind to a halt in a bottleneck of mud and steel. Fort Eben-Emael was the guardian of those bridges. From its elevated position on the plateau, the fort's heavy artillery could pick off a single tank crossing those bridges from miles away. It could blanket the entire region in fire, turning the canal into a graveyard for the Wehrmacht. The strategic implications were massive. The trap: if Eben-Emael held, German armor would be funneled into killing zones where Belgian and French reinforcements could pick them apart. The stalling action: the fortress wasn't designed to win the war on its own, it was designed to buy time. Every hour the Germans spent trying to crack Eben-Emael was an hour for the French and British to move their best divisions into position. The keystone: without Eben-Emael, the entire northern end of the Allied defensive line would simply collapse. The Belgian High Command had spared no expense. Inside the fort was a self-sustaining city. It had its own power plant, massive air filtration systems to protect against gas attacks, and enough food and ammunition to last for months of heavy combat. The 1,200 men stationed there weren't just soldiers, they were the elite keepers of a modern citadel. They went to sleep every night believing they were safe behind meters of rock and steel. They expected the Germans to arrive with heavy siege howitzers and thousands of infantrymen. They expected a battle of attrition, a slow, bloody struggle against the walls. They were prepared for everything except the one thing that was actually coming. Every fortress in history has a fatal flaw. For Troy, it was a wooden horse. For Singapore, it was guns that couldn't turn toward the land. For Eben-Emael, the flaw was a failure of imagination. The architects of the fort had looked at the world through the eyes of the Great War. They built against the threats they knew, massive artillery barrages from the horizon and waves of infantry charging from the valley below. They fortified the slopes, cleared the forests for line of sight, and dug deep into the mountain. But they left a gaping hole in their logic: the roof. The top of the plateau was a vast, flat expanse of grass. Because the fort was built into the earth, the roof was essentially the surface of the ground. The Belgians assumed this area was safe. After all, any enemy attempting to climb the steep 60-meter cliffs of the Albert Canal to reach the top would be slaughtered by machine gun fire from the fort's side-facing bunkers. They operated under a series of dangerous assumptions. Paratroopers were for cities. The concept of paratroopers was new, and most military thinkers believed they could only be used to capture bridges or airfields, not to attack a hardened fortress. The anti-air myth. The fort had a few machine guns for anti-aircraft defense, but they were considered secondary. No one believed a heavy bomber could accurately drop enough men onto that specific patch of grass to make a difference. The impossible landing. The plateau was too small for transport planes to land. Paratroopers jumping from heights would be scattered by the wind and picked off one by one. To the Belgian commanders, the idea of an assault from above sounded like science fiction. It was a theoretical impossibility. German intelligence, however, had noticed this green roof. They saw that while the walls were encased in steel, the top of the fortress was essentially a park. If you could get men onto that grass, silently, accurately, and in force, you wouldn't have to fight your way through the front door. You would already be in the house. But how do you land a strike team on the roof of a fortress without being heard? How do you destroy a steel turret that can withstand a 500-pound bomb using only what a soldier can carry? The Germans had found an answer in two secret weapons: the glider and the hollow charge. The stage was set. The Invincible fortress was about to be attacked at its most vulnerable point by an enemy that refused to play by the rules of the past. The clock was ticking, and the 1,200 men inside Eben Emael had no idea that the sky was about to fall. The Belgian defenders inside the turrets heard a metallic clunk against the outer steel of their cupolas. They assumed it was a grenade, a futile gesture against 10 inches of hardened Krupp steel. They were wrong. The German engineers were deploying hollow charges, or shaped charges. At the time, this was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the German arsenal. Unlike a standard explosive that radiates energy in all directions, a shaped charge is designed with a conical liner. When detonated, the physics of the explosion collapses the cone into a narrow, hypersonic jet of molten metal and plasma. The results were catastrophic and instantaneous. Surgical penetration. A 50-kilogram shaped charge placed on the roof of a turret didn't just dent the armor, it punched a neat 6-inch hole through the steel as if it were hot wax. The internal inferno. The jet of molten metal didn't stop at the armor, it sprayed into the interior of the turret, igniting the ready-use ammunition and incinerating the crews instantly. The blinding effect. One by one, the massive 120mm Maastricht guns, the ones meant to stop the German 4th Panzer Division, were silenced. The Germans didn't need to destroy the whole fort, they just needed to destroy the eyes and teeth. The paratroopers then moved to the ventilation shafts. They dropped specialized explosives and smoke canisters into the intake valves. Within minutes, the sophisticated air filtration system that the Belgians were so proud of became a liability, pumping thick, acrid cordite smoke into the lower galleries. The fortress wasn't being breached in the traditional sense. It wasn't being blown apart by heavy artillery. It was being neutralized. The attackers were like surgeons removing the vital organs of a giant while it was still waking up. The Belgian crews were alive, buried under 60 meters of rock, but they were suddenly trapped in the dark, unable to see the enemy and unable to fire a single retaliatory shot. Inside the labyrinthine tunnels of Aben Emal, the atmosphere shifted from sleepy routine to a waking nightmare in less than 15 minutes. The command center, located deep in the bowels of the mountain, was a scene of escalating panic. Telephone lines to the surface turrets were suddenly dead. Reports filtered in of monsters on the roof, of explosions that didn't sound like shells, and of a strange blinding light that had melted through the armored doors. Major Jotrand, the fort's commander, faced a tactical paradox. He had over 1,000 soldiers under his command, but they were trained for a siege from the outside. The tunnels were narrow, designed to move ammunition, not to fight a close-quarters battle against elite paratroopers who had already seized the high ground of the roof. Communication breakdown. Because the Germans had destroyed the radio masts and observation posts within the first 6 minutes, Jotrand was essentially blind. He didn't know if he was being attacked by a division or a platoon. Isolation. The different sections of the fort were designed to be self-contained to prevent the spread of fire. Now that same design meant that each gun crew was isolated. They sat in their concrete cells, listening to the muffled thuds above them, waiting for a breach that had already happened. The doctrine of paralysis. Belgian military doctrine assumed that any attack would be preceded by hours of shelling, giving them time to mobilize. The German surgical paralysis gave them no such window. Above them, on the windy plateau, fewer than 85 German soldiers, the survivors of the glider landings, were holding the entire fortress at bay. They were vastly outnumbered, but they held the initiative. Every time a Belgian exit door creaked open to attempt a counterattack, a German team was there with a flamethrower or a machine gun to seal it back up. The defenders were experiencing a total systemic failure. The Invincible fortress had become a tomb. The heavy guns that were supposed to save Belgium were pointing uselessly at the horizon, while the real battle was being fought in the grass directly above the barrels. By the afternoon of May 10th, the sun hung high over the Albert Canal, illuminating a scene that would have been unthinkable just 6 hours prior. The great watchdog of Belgium was silent. The fall of Aben Emal didn't look like the climactic battles of the 19th century. There were no grand bayonet charges up the slopes, no heroic last stands on the ramparts with colors flying. Instead, there was a strange, suffocating stillness. Below the surface, 1,200 Belgian soldiers remained alive, yet they were effectively paralyzed. Above them, a handful of German paratroopers, dusty, exhausted, but triumphant, sat on the very turrets that were supposed to dominate the region. When the German ground forces, the 4th Panzer Division and the 151st Infantry Regiment finally reached the canal, they didn't have to fight their way across under a hail of fortress fire. They simply crossed the bridges that the paratroopers had seized or preserved. The impregnable stronghold had been reduced to a spectator in its own invasion. The psychological collapse. Inside the fort, the darkness and the smell of sulfur created an atmosphere of pure dread. Major Jotrand and his officers realized the horrific truth. They were being held hostage by a force they couldn't see, using weapons they didn't understand. Every attempt to send a squad to the surface resulted in a slaughter at the exit hatches. The surrender. On the morning of May 11th, after just 24 hours of combat, the white flag was raised. The doors of the fortress creaked open, and a stream of Belgian soldiers emerged, blinking in the sunlight, surrendering to a German force that was a fraction of their size. The shock waves of this surrender rippled across the globe. In London and Paris, military commanders were stunned into a state of disbelief. If Aben Emal, the most sophisticated fortress on the planet, could fall in one day, then the entire Allied strategy was built on sand. The phony war was over, and the era of the static defense was dead. History often remembers the fall of Aben Amal as a miracle of German luck or a failure of Belgian bravery, but the truth is far more clinical and far more terrifying. Aben Amal didn't fall because it was weak. It didn't fall because its walls were too thin or its soldiers were cowards. It fell because it was a masterpiece of the past. Its designers had planned for a battlefield that no longer existed. They had perfected the art of the 1914 siege, envisioning artillery duels, massive cannons trading shells across miles of countryside, infantry assaults, human waves breaking against barbed wire and machine gun nests, long sieges, supply lines, and endurance were the deciding factors. They failed to account for the radical acceleration of technology. They didn't plan for vertical envelopment, the idea that an army could simply fly over a wall. Precision sabotage, the shift from brute force explosives to the focused energy of the shaped charge. The velocity of information, a war where speed and initiative could overcome concrete and steel. The fortress was perfect, but it was perfect for a world that had vanished the moment the first glider lifted off the ground in Germany. Aben Amal serves as a permanent warning to history. It proves that no matter how thick the walls, no matter how deep the tunnels, or how many billions are spent on defense, the greatest vulnerability of any fortress is the assumption of safety. Modern warfare didn't announce its arrival with a thunderous bombardment that shook the earth. It announced itself with the soft hiss of a glider's wings and the silent, focused heat of a shaped charge burning through a perfect defense. The era of the castle was over. The era of the lightning war began.